Great. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We have a very exciting, wild presenter with us tonight. My name's Carolyn McClintock. I'm going to host this evening, and I am a volunteer board member with the Friends Group for Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And some of you may not know this, but we are the only national refuge in the state of Ohio, and there's over 500 of them across the country. Yet we're the only one in the state of Ohio. We also are the best spot to catch a glimpse of a bald eagle. We preserve and conserve over 10,000 acres in Northwest Ohio. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Jake Schoen is a wildlife coordinator. I'm sorry, not a wildlife, wild guy. Coordinator for the Toledo Zoo. He works to conserve and restore our local ecosystems by installing and maintaining urban prairies and native landscapes. So I'm going to pass the floor to him. If you have questions as the night goes on, feel free to write them in the chat room and we will get to them. So now I'm going to try to figure out, Tom, how to pass the screen over to Jake.
Well, Jake, you're co-hosted, so you should be able to share your screen.
Great, I'll try that right now.
Carolyn, I put the 3 links in the chat room. Could you talk about those for a moment?
Sure, there's Tom put 3 links in there in the chat room for you to check out. One of them is a survey, so we can give Jake some feedback. One of them is a link to our website, so you can learn a little bit more about us. And the third one is a link to our event page, so you can see what other upcoming activities and educational sessions that we have. Jake, thanks for being here. It's all yours.
Great, thanks for having me. And is my slideshow screen showing up okay for you?
It is.
Excellent. So yeah, again, I'm Jake Schoen. I'm the Wild Toledo Coordinator at the Toledo Zoo, and most of my work at the zoo revolves around native plants and propagating them and getting them out into the community where we can help support our local wildlife kind of from the ground up. Now, when most people think of zoos, they think of kind of the captive side of the breeding and kind of safety populations that are maintained, within captivity at the zoo. And we certainly participate in that type of conservation. But really, it's only a piece of the much larger puzzle. And in fact, it's really not worth the captive side of things if we don't have suitable wild habitat to release these species into eventually, or ideally, prevent them from needing this type of captive care to bring them back from the brink. And so we like to augment the captive side of things with some in situ conservation as well. So this map just shows kind of a wide variety of projects that the Toledo Zoo has going on all across the globe. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this and go all that into detail. But the idea basically is that, we like to complement having species in captivity with also supporting them out in the wild and improving their habitat or studying their natural behaviors and learning on, how we can conserve these animals out in the wild, in the environment, without strictly relying on captivity as a means for conservation. Now, as a zoo goer, a lot of our mission revolves around inspiring our guests to join us in conserving the natural world. Now, many of our guests are Ohio residents or Toledo residents, and there's not a whole lot you can do to impact, the conservation of Tasmanian devils in Tasmania from your yard here in Toledo. Obviously, there's donations and that sort of thing, which certainly go a long way. But we like to also embrace, and show people what they can do to have the largest impact possible. And oftentimes that actually revolves around conservation right in our own backyard. So fortunately, conservation is not needed only in faraway places. There's plenty of imperiled species right here in our own backyards. And these are species that we more directly interact with and can impact just with tiny changes in our everyday lives. So in addition to our global projects, we are involved in tons of local conservation. And again, I'm not going to go super far into detail here, but you can see just a wide variety. Some of you may be familiar with our annual sturgeon release in the Maumee River. We have a hellbender release in eastern and southeastern Ohio. We have raised various listed butterfly species, monarchs, other imperiled turtles in the state, you name it. And the public involvement at these releases is an amazing tool for capturing the public interest and getting their attention so that we can educate them about the different hardships that some of these species are facing. And often after we are interacting with the public at something, an event, say the sturgeon release, one of their first questions is, what can we do to help further the cause kind of in their own? And the first step in any species, in conserving any species, is really to restore the habitat upon which they depend. And so any person or business or other party that holds any kind of property, be it a small apartment with a tiny balcony, or a multi-acre farm or property, is able to make quite a big difference here. So as I mentioned, if you want to help restore local wildlife, it really starts at the bottom of the food chain, and that would be with plants, specifically native plants. So plants that are native are ones that have co-evolved with our native wildlife. And so over immense timescales, they have developed these really intricate relationships. And essentially the plants have evolved and adapted to use wildlife for things like pollination or seed dispersal. And our wildlife has adapted to use our plants for things like food and habitat and shelter. And these relationships take an incredibly long time to build. For example, caterpillars, like you see in the center of your screen here, that's a monarch caterpillar feeding on milkweed. Many people know that caterpillars eat plants. Not everyone appreciates that caterpillars are very specific in the plants that they can consume. So monarchs, for example, can only eat milkweed species, which is a fairly small number of species in the state. And it's actually really interesting. The monarch caterpillars are forced to specialize because of some unique tricks that plants have up their sleeve to prevent themselves from getting eaten. And so, of course, plants, if you think of it from a plant perspective, they don't want to be eaten. And so they actually produce quite a bit of toxins that discourage herbivory or eating of their leaves or flowers by species such as caterpillars. And so it's kind of a chemical warfare in a sense against would-be predators. And so the predators, like these caterpillars, have to adapt to tolerate these toxins so that they can eat without poisoning themselves. And so that's a pretty tough and long process for them to adapt to. And so monarch caterpillars, like most herbivorous caterpillars, have kind of selected just a narrow range of plants that they're able to tolerate these toxins from. And, you know, for every example, well-known example like the monarch, there's hundreds of other species that all have their own certain plant that they've closely evolved with and depend upon in order to survive. And then, you know, I've talked a lot about caterpillars here, which are kind of the second step on the food chain. But the caterpillars go on to feed the birds go on to feed the foxes and raptors and so forth. And this kind of trickles on, but the base of the food chain is really these plants, specifically the native plants that our wildlife has adapted to eat. Now, exotic plants typically don't fit into these food webs in the same way. So some can provide nectar or shelter, for example, but native plants provide, you know, nectar, shelter, and food, and, you know, in other cases, even more, you know, resources to wildlife that these exotic species just haven't been ingrained in the ecosystem. And so essentially wildlife, in a lot of cases, doesn't really know how to fully utilize these non-native ornamental or even invasive plant species. And in addition—
Hey, Jake, can I interrupt you real fast?
Sure.
Would you like any questions along the way, or do you want to wait to the end? How do you want to handle that?
Let's do them along the way.
Okay, well, I got a couple for you.
Sure.
What can we do to bypass neighborhood ordinances?
That's a great question. And I will touch on this a little bit later on. But just in short, you know, a lot of neighborhood ordinances will have specific regulations that will prohibit you from creating more wild type habitat, like a prairie, or something that you might see, you know, out at the refuge or in a metro park. That's not the traditional kind of formal landscape. And so to get around that, there's actually a whole list of hundreds of native plant species that can actually be substituted for other formal ornamental plants within like a typical mulched garden bed. And so you can still have the benefits of natives, but you can maintain a more formal look that isn't going to raise eyebrows from your neighbors or your HOA or that sort of thing.
Okay, very good. So would you say grass is probably the worst plant? How can you recommend how to turn a shady front yard into a native garden?
So
without chemicals, I guess is the key thing. Without spraying the lawn to kill it, is there a better way?
So if it's just turf grass, it's actually very easy to just get a sod cutter or even just a square point shovel. And you can just remove that top inch or two of the sod. And up with it will come all of the plant roots, at least any roots that are capable of regenerating. And so just hauling away that top layer and planting within the remaining soil is a very easy way to go about prepping a site for planting without relying on chemicals at all.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So this graphic here, it's actually a 3D diorama in the Museum of Natural History at the zoo in our native prairie exhibit. But it does a great job of demonstrating some of the environmental benefits to native plants, in addition to the more ecological ones that we just spoke about. And so native plants will kind of lock up the soil and prevent that erosion. The deep roots have tons of tissue underground that is all, you know, created from carbon that's pulled out of the air. So it's actually a great carbon sink and helps sequester carbon to help combat climate change. And it's also fantastic at slowing down water on the surface and reducing runoff and helping water actually infiltrate back into the ground rather than making its way into our local waterways with various chemicals, fertilizers, you name it. And so it really slows down water on the surface. Additionally, you can see how deep the roots are on native species, which are represented on the left here, in comparison to turf grass or a lot of our common agricultural plants, which are very shallow rooted. And so these deep roots, in the case of many of our native species, make them incredibly drought tolerant and very low maintenance in the landscape. So if you select the proper native plant that fits the habitat in your yard or business, they're essentially maintenance free. You don't have to prune them, you don't have to supplementally water them with irrigation or stand out there with a hose. You don't have to apply fertilizer. They have adapted to grow in our area for incredibly long time periods, and so they don't need any additional help from us that might be required from most of our other commonly cultivated species. Even turf grass a lot of times will require sprinkler systems, or roses might require pesticides at different times of year to prevent them from succumbing to pests. Whereas these native plants, as long as you choose a plant, if you have a sunny, dry yard and you choose a plant that's adapted sunny, dry conditions here, it's going to thrive without any real input from you. And this can be a huge benefit from a maintenance and a resource saving standpoint, because you don't have to spend the money or the time mowing a lawn or applying all these chemicals, or even gardening, pruning, that sort of thing. And that can also be a major selling point to helping get people on board with promoting natives and bringing them into their own house.
I think that's a great point, because you stand in line at Lowe's and everybody in front of you has a lawnmower, all these tools, pesticides, and everything. We've been hoodwinked to think that that's what we're supposed to be doing, when really, if we just let it go natural, we can be out playing instead of doing chores.
That's exactly right. Every time I'm driving out in the country with these huge plots of land, and I see the guys, riding their riding mower. I mean, it must take them 5-6 hours just to mow the land, and by the time you're done, you practically have to start up again. So it's a pretty bizarre kind of cultural thing here in the States that I think we're slowly starting to question, which is fantastic. Yeah, when you really sit down and think about it, it's actually pretty bizarre. I'm not against using turf in areas where it's actually used, parks and whatnot. If you're playing sports or running the dog or you name it, even a portion of a backyard. But I think we really need to transition to think about putting lawn, where we need it, and not as a default. We should default to native plantings that support wildlife and support our environment, and then just intentionally place turf grass and other, ornamental or non-native species in places where they actually make sense. So you don't have to be a total purist about it, but I do think it's a good trend that we're seeing to start, really questioning, is it worth maintaining turf in the back corner of your property where, the only time you access it is when you're on a mower?
Right.
Probably not. And so after learning about all of these reasons and benefits, and kind of getting people interested in going native, whether just branching into it slowly, or just fully converting, the first question that we get asked is, how do I go about actually incorporating natives, and where can I get them? You mentioned you're at the big box store perusing the nursery, and it's really tricky to find any natives at all. And a lot of times, if you do find a native species, it's like a cultivar, which may not have these same benefits as the straight wild type species. And so up until recently, it's actually been fairly difficult to locate true native species to bring them into your yard. And this is what kind of kicked off Wild Toledo, which is a subset of our conservation department at the zoo. And the whole mission of Wild Toledo is to provide native plants in various forms for people to get them out into the community. And so we provide the materials for anyone to do it themselves by buying just potted plants at the nursery, or we can even take care of the design, the installation, and the maintenance of a formal native landscape or a more wild type prairie. And so essentially we have three main branches of the Wild Toledo initiative. That would be our urban prairie initiative, which you can see an example of on the left there. Our native retail nursery in the center. And then most recently, we've added a formal native landscaping initiative, which, as I mentioned, will design and install and even maintain these native landscapes for interested parties.
That's fantastic, because I think most people don't know how to start. Are you finding that other zoos are doing this? Because I know we have guests on from Columbus and Cincinnati.
I know that Cincinnati is doing something similar. They at least have a native plant nursery, and I believe Cleveland does. But aside from the three of us, nobody's really doing it yet, but hopefully more zoos will catch on. But it's kind of neat that Ohio's kind of a stronghold for this sort of thing, and hopefully we can spread it all across the country and beyond.
Gretchen wants to ask a question. Do you have recommendations where we can see these types of mature, intentional native landscapes? And I would imagine I don't know her, is she up near you? So the zoo would be one.
Yeah, we have some right outside the Museum of Natural History is a ton of purely native plantings. And we're actually working to transition many beds throughout the park to entirely native. And so the zoo would be a fantastic place to see some. The formal kind of landscape side of things is actually fairly new. So we've only been installing them for like 2 years now. And so we're actually still working on gathering kind of more of a full gallery that we could go on to show you. So we're working on building up even larger examples, but currently the best place that you could see them would be around the zoo, particularly in front of the Museum of Natural History.
Great.
And actually, on that note, the bottom right photo there is actually one of those native plantings at the zoo that we've installed.
Beautiful.
One of the first ones, yeah. So now I just wanted to kind of delve a little deeper into these three different facets and help, explain, when some may be preferred over others, and kind of the rough general process that's involved in installing them. So native prairies, like you see in this photo, are ideal for larger areas. They're incredibly cost effective, and they establish relatively quickly, usually in 3 years or so. It's often great to mow walking paths through them. And actually the complexity that you see in these prairies mimics more of a naturalistic, like wild setting, in that they're very complex with the plant assortment, and they're actually the best at supporting wildlife. So a native prairie will support even more species than a native formal landscape, just because by its very nature, the formal landscapes are kind of simplified a bit. But both are incredibly beneficial. Now, the prairies in these larger areas also have a selling point of being temporary and reversible if needed. So we actually work with a lot of developers who may have large parcels of land that have, plans for future development, maybe 10, 15 years down the line. But they don't want to, so they wouldn't want to plant like a native forest or something that would, be very labor intensive and take a long time to establish. But they also don't want to just maintain turf. And so, it isn't ideal that it might have an expiration date on a prairie, but 10 or 15 years of a site as a prairie is certainly a lot better than that same site being a turf field for the same amount of time. And so some people that can be quite attractive as well, especially around the city, even in industrial areas. And so that's kind of another hidden perk of this sort of installation. They do tend to look best on a larger scale, so I typically don't recommend installing these much smaller than a quarter, maybe an eighth of an acre. And usually this is not the type of planting that I would recommend for planting like in your front yard. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of times there's various HOA regulations that would actually prohibit such a planting. So these I think of more as kind of being a backyard or a large parcel type installation rather than a front yard or small scale install like we'll talk about here in a second. And so here's another photo of a prairie actually at the zoo. So this is one of our employee parking lots kind of behind the scenes. And for decades, all of this area was mowed, and the only traffic that it saw was employees walking down the sidewalk to get to the zoo. It served no purpose. It costed the zoo quite a bit of labor and resources to maintain it. And so this is a great candidate for converting to a prairie. It's virtually maintenance free. It supports an outstanding amount of wildlife. And it looks fantastic too, here behind the scenes at the zoo. So this is kind of step one of a prairie. So this is actually the other side of that same employee lot. It too was a mowed turf field when we purchased it years ago. And so for the same reasons, we wanted to convert this into a useful habitat for native wildlife rather than spending our resources and time maintaining it as a mowed field. And actually, mowed turf fields are a wonderful candidate for conversion because they tend to be have a limited invasive weedy seed bank. The repeated mowing tends to kill those plants before they can seed and spread. And so after just a few years of maintained mowing, it's essentially a sterile field except for the existing grass, which results in a pretty painless establishment of the prairie without weeds constantly popping up out of the seed bank.
Can you go back 2 slides, Jake? We have a couple questions about what plants, if you can identify some of those plants.
Sure. So at the bottom left, the yellow species is lanceleaf coreopsis. This is one that is incredibly drought tolerant, thrives in full sun, and is actually one of the first species to germinate and grow. It's kind of an early successional species. And that's actually the same for most of the plants in here. So the coreopsis was the yellow with the yellow center. Slightly to the right at the bottom, there's a yellow with a dark center, and that's a black-eyed Susan. The red is a blanket flower. And then we have a mint, which is the purple color kind of in the center. And all of these species are actually very early successional, and they actually end up getting choked out by the more persistent but slower to establish native species. In fact, a few of these were actually contaminants in the seed mix, so blanket flower is not even a Ohio native species. and that just came in from birds or what have you. But we let it be for the year because the following year it gets choked out by some of the hardier, longer-lived native species like bergamot, which bee balm is another name for it, or some of the helianthus species, the various native sunflowers. A lot of milkweeds take longer to establish, but those tend to be kind of appearing and really taking a strong hold in year maybe 3 or 4, whereas this snapshot was actually taken in year 2 of a very young prairie. So it is really interesting to see that species kind of cycle through and then kind of finalize after year 3 or 4.
Linda wants to know, what is a good early spring native pollinator plant?
So our earliest native plants to bloom are actually tend to be woodland species. So a lot of our spring ephemerals, we have some gorgeous trilliums. Actually, great white trillium is the state wildflower here in Ohio. We have Virginia bluebells, trout lilies, skunk cabbage is an interesting one. Hepaticas. We have rue anemone. There's all sorts of really beautiful woodland species that tend to be the first to flower. I would say for full sun, especially in a prairie type habitat, one of the earliest blooms that we have in this sort of setting would be the lanceleaf coreopsis and foxglove beard tongue, which is a really pretty white bell-shaped bloom. But it is kind of interesting that most of the prairie plants actually start blooming a bit later in spring to early summer and will persist all the way through late fall, sometimes even blooming here in November or December in a particularly warm year.
Any suggestions on groundhogs eating black-eyed Susans?
Just keep planting them.
Get a dog?
Yeah, get a dog. I can tell you we have groundhogs that inhabit a lot of our prairies. And while they do definitely feast on some plants, if you keep rotating different species through, you generally can find some that they're not going to be quite as interested in, or if you can continue adding to the amount of them out there and you can just kind of overwhelm them with feeding options, and then it tends to, they might get grazed, but they generally will come back rather than getting kind of killed by them by just overfeeding on them. If you have a particular plant that maybe you just planted and it's a bit delicate, you could consider at least temporarily just throwing up a ring of fencing around it as well. I've done that at some point just to establish a larger patch of it, and then you can remove the fencing, and generally, part of it may get mowed down, but it tends to persist a little better that way as well. So as a starting point, again, we have the turf grass. Our first step is to go in and remove the turf. So depending on the site, this could be with a sod cutter. Sometimes you can even use fire to scorch it. And herbicide is another example, which is sometimes used on larger scales. But as we talked about earlier, if you're doing this on a much smaller scale, certainly I would really just recommend using the sod removal method. But here we've gone in and killed all of the turf and eliminated the remaining weeds. And it is important to do this several times throughout the year. So there are weeds that will germinate only in the spring and then go dormant. So if you go in and kill the plants in late summer, you're not actually going to eradicate those spring weeds. And the same could be said for spring, summer, and fall. So ideally, you're going to go out there and continually remove the weeds for an entire growing season, just to confirm that they are indeed exhausted from the seed bank. So you just have clean, seedless soil that we can then put in what we want. Now, on large scales, we actually use this seed drill, which slices, it's a no-till drill. It creates small slices in the soil and drops the seed at very precise and comparatively shallow depth compared to most like agricultural equipment. Many native species actually require light to germinate. And so rather than putting them in the soil and covering them with, a substantial amount of soil, many of them are actually just kind of pressed in where they're still exposed from the top, but they're in contact with the soil so that they can wick up moisture to germinate. And so we use this seed drill and a tractor for most of our prairie installations, although it is also possible on smaller scales just to broadcast the seed and then lightly rake it in by hand like you might do with turf grass if you're planting grass in like a patch in your yard or something. So it's equally easy to do, just not as feasible on a larger scale. But seeding is best done in the winter. So we typically wait for December for everything to go dormant. And that prevents any seeds from sprouting too early where they can actually get killed by a frost that might occur before they're hardened off. And so December is great because there's no chance that they're going to sprout until the following spring. It's also ideal to sow them in the winter because most of our native species actually require that cold period to break the dormancy mechanisms in the seed in order for them to germinate. So if you plant native seeds in the spring, oftentimes they'll actually not grow for that entire growing season. They sit dormant for the following winter, and that's what will then trigger them to grow a year from then. So by sowing them in the winter, we eliminate the amount of time that they spend as a seed out in the field where birds and other wildlife can eat them. So they sit dormant for a couple months, and then in April or May, they would have had enough cold exposure, and the warm temperatures and the spring rains are perfect for encouraging them to grow. So after seeding is kind of the messy establishment period. And it's generally 1 to 3 years where the site does look a bit rough in conventional terms. It doesn't look like what you and I would probably consider a prairie from afar. The plants are growing and they're establishing and they're maturing, but a lot of that growth is actually underground at first, and there's very little blooms. And because there's not a lot of above ground growth, we often see weedy species that are opportunists, like dandelions, which you can see in this photo, that will kind of move in and quickly colonize these voids in the field. And so this is usually the toughest part to get this public support for, and it really helps to educate with signage and programming and whatnot to kind of show, what the end goal is and kind of convey to them that this is only a temporary state as the prairie's maturing. And so, as I said, we generally put up quite a bit of signage, particularly during this phase, and we found that dramatically improves public reception and maintains support for this sort of installation. But after 3 to 4 years, we start seeing, what most people would recognize as a true prairie. So this is that same site
Nice.
4 years later. And this one actually has more of the persistent prairie species that you see in contrast to that first prairie image that I spoke about. So here you can see some of the yellow blooms with yellow centers. Those are oxeye or early sunflowers. The purple is the purple coneflower. There's also some yellow blooms with the longer petals that are downward facing. That's gray-headed coneflower. And those are all species that tend to be kind of in it for the long haul. We see them from year 4 and beyond. They stick around. So this is kind of a end result prairie in a lot of ways. This snapshot just happens to have maybe half a dozen species in it, but as a whole, these prairies typically have anywhere from 30 to 50 or more species spread throughout. And the seed gets kind of evenly scattered everywhere throughout the site, but it tends to grow and thrive only in the sites, like the microhabitats that are suitable to it. So in wetter areas, we may have other species that kind of fill in, whereas in dry spots, you'd have more of the drought tolerant ones. But we like to kind of throw the kitchen sink at it and, you know, tailor the mix to the site in general and spread all of those seeds everywhere, and then let nature kind of decide, you know, what plants establish where. But this is a nice example of more of a mature prairie. And as I mentioned, there's incredibly low maintenance associated with this. You know, basically at this point, you just have to wander through and spot treat any weeds by pulling or selectively mowing, or in some cases herbicide. And actually my favorite method for maintaining these and eradicating invasive species is to use prescribed fire and actually burn them every 3 to 5 years. And that alone is typically enough to maintain them as relatively invasive species free. So that's a couple hours of work from a skilled burn crew every 3 years to maintain this versus hundreds of hours a year to maintain it as turf. And it's incredibly cheap comparatively as well. And of course, it's a wildlife hotspot. And so just to kind of hit this home, or I guess first, here's a quick video. So this shows some of our prairie sites developing over the years at the zoo. We started on grounds and then quickly branched to schools and businesses and private homeowners throughout the region, and are now approaching 100 prairies all over Ohio. And we actually recently added another prairie down in Tennessee at the bottom there. And as you can see, that network of prairies on a larger scale, even if they're a half acre, if you have enough half-acre prairies in close proximity, they can act and function as a much larger ecosystem that can support species that depend and require, you know, much larger home ranges than just a half acre, but they can be incredibly valuable. So this is just kind of to drive that point home. Last year, we actually caught and radio collared a red fox, a wild fox at the zoo. This animal lives in the wild. It's not a captive animal or anything. And we fit it with a GPS collar and then released it right where we caught it shortly after. And that GPS collar that you can see around its neck in the top left corner recorded its location every 2 hours for about 3 months, and then it automatically dropped off the animal. And we were able to retrieve all of these points. So each green dot that you see on this map is the fox's location at some point in that 3-month span. Each dot is 2 hours apart. And so you can see that it ventured all throughout the zoo, but also through other natural areas like Delaware Creek and along the river. But it's really neat to see, because when you zoom in, this fox navigated and spent a majority of its time actually in our on-grounds prairies. It actually denned in our prairie along the river off of Broadway Street and spent the majority of the daylight hours there. And then it would spend an incredible high percentage of its time in some of our other sites on the north side of the trail, like the solar array where we have several acres of prairie. And in that case, it was presumably hunting and looking for mates and that sort of thing. So it's really neat to see them use a network of prairies. And even a small backyard, can contribute in the same sort of way. So you don't have to feel like, you need to do everything in your small footprint, but if enough people do help, change things in their own backyard, we really can impact things on a much larger scale.
Nice to get some good news. Jake, do you sell at the zoo packets of seeds or big bags of the seeds that you're talking about?
We don't actually sell seeds at this point because we've been using it. We just have such a high demand for it for our installations and for the nursery. So at this point, we do have enough seed to do installations. If you're looking for doing it yourself, there are a few vendors online that have native mixes that are well suited for the area. The Ohio Prairie Nursery has a ton of Ohio native species. Prairie Moon Nursery also has hundreds of Ohio native species with some really nice mixes that suit basically any habitat. Prairie Nursery is another one that's really nice. And we're hoping to, in the future, be able to offer seed packets as well for these sort of installs. But that brings up kind of flows nicely into the next topic, which is we do offer head-started plants in the nursery. So this is a snapshot of our native plant nursery. It's actually located in the outskirts of the zoo, kind of by our overflow parking lot. But we actually grow over 500 species of native plants in this nursery. And we grow wildflowers, grasses, sedges, shrubs, trees, you name it. And we have plants for every type of environment, full sun to full shade, semi-aquatic to, sand dune dwelling species, you name it. And this is a really great option for do-it-yourself people, or maybe if you're doing a smaller installation, or if you have an existing garden that isn't necessarily comprised of native species, but you want to slowly transition towards natives, this is a great way where maybe you can, phase out an ornamental non-native in one patch of your garden and plant in a few native, equivalents. And so that's a really kind of cost-effective and a realistic approach to converting towards natives without, scratching and burning everything and starting fresh all at once, which a lot of people find a little more palatable. And so we actually sell
everyone's loving your presentation, so I'm gonna have to bury you with some more questions.
Sure.
Okay, what are your thoughts on how important local genomes are?
Yeah, so the local genome or local genotype is talked about pretty frequently. So essentially, the idea is that plant is, a species may be native to Ohio, but oftentimes they will occur in a much wider range. And the idea is that there's a local adaptation, so that maybe a black-eyed Susan from Toledo would be better suited for life in Toledo compared to a black-eyed Susan in Wisconsin, for example. And there is some literature that suggests this. In a lot of cases, it's actually taken from plant populations that are growing on mountains, and it compares them at various elevations. And it did show that, one species, even though it's the same species, certain populations from the higher altitudes are better suited to life up there than they are at the base of the mountain. And the same is true for populations from lower down when they're grown up high. So there's definitely, you know, a lot of science backing that up. However, it is actually pretty lacking for other examples that don't involve like mountain type growing. And so there are some rough guidelines known as ecoregions that kind of generalize at various scales similar climates and habitats. And so that's a nice kind of rough guideline to go by. And it's always good to, you know, try to get something from an area as close to you as possible. But ultimately, in my opinion, we're kind of in a crisis here in terms of loss of habitat and the need to, you know, get native plants back out in the environment as quick as we can in order to stop the loss of these species. And so, in my opinion, I'm not quite as strict as some people may be in the local genotype side of things. I found that, you know, for example, plants that are taken from popular suppliers in Wisconsin or Minnesota, we find that they do just as well here as some of our local genotype stock. And it kind of eliminates a bottleneck of supplying very specific local genotype seed, which can be difficult to source in enough quantity to do large-scale restoration as quick as we would like to see it done. So it's definitely something to consider. But in my opinion, you know, it's kind of needs to be taken with a grain of salt and be weighed against the consequences of potentially not installing habitat just because it's tough to source enough of that seed
Right.
from a precise area.
Thank you. I know we're running against the clock, so I'm sorry. I'll save a couple more of these towards the end, but I'll let you continue.
Sure. So I'll go a little quicker here. So we actually sell these plants online at wildtoledo.org, and we have a really nice filter feature that you can see on the left side there, especially if you're just starting out and you might not know what plant is appropriate for your yard. You can go on the website here and select, you know, that you want a plant for full sun, that likes dry soil, that gets 3 feet tall and is purple in color, and it will filter all of those options down, which is a really handy resource for picking and choosing what species might be best suited for your yard. I'm going to go really rapid fire through these photos here.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so there's a common misconception that native species aren't as attractive as ornamental species are. And so I really like to just put that rumor to rest right away. So again, I'm going to go rapid fire through these, but this is round-lobed hepatica. It's a woodland native. We have purple coneflower, butterfly milkweed, marsh marigold. This is snowberry, and I believe this one is Drummond aster. Dotted horse mint, which is a state endangered species in the oak openings region. We even have native orchids that are incredibly showy, and I think put any non-native ornamental to shame, in my opinion. This is another one, rose begonia. We even have native lilies that are much better suited and much more ecologically useful for native wildlife. And in my opinion, they put any of the common daylilies or tiger lilies to shame as well. So this is a great substitute for those common ornamental species that is truly native to the area. This is rock harlequin. We have fire pink, swamp milkweed, and then, you know, in addition to these beautiful blooms that you can incorporate into the landscape, it's really neat to see the wildlife flocking to them. So we have, you know, it's like a whole city of pollinators that appear around these hotspot plantings. And you can see some really gorgeous wildlife moving in as well. such as this cuckoo wasp. This is a peck skipper, and even leafhoppers, which look like a completely tropical and exotic animal, and they will crawl all over a native planting. This is a really interesting long-legged fly, and of course monarch butterflies, which can be supported by incorporating milkweed into the landscape. And even inside of stems, we have solitary bees that take advantage of dead stems in the spring and fall, and they actually jam their eggs and then partition them with pollen, and then the eggs hatch, and these larvae will feed on the pollen all summer and then emerge the following spring. So it's really an endless source of entertainment if you kind of learn where to look and what to look for. And it's really outstanding, just the sheer number of species that can be supported from even a small native planting. Even a planter box on a balcony, for example. You don't even need a lawn. And then our last initiative here is the more formal landscape side of Wild Toledo. And this, as I mentioned, is better suited for smaller scale areas or even front yards where you don't want to be quite as unruly as some prairies may be. These prairies certainly have their place, but a more formal landscape generally is better received by the public, just because of the kind of odd historical societal association we have with mulch and common clusters of the same color and gaps in between plants. We're kind of conditioned to like that, and so this helps kind of bridge the gap between a wild native habitat and a useless but attractive formal planting. And I think it helps us kind of appeal to a wider audience because you can have both. You really can. You can have the aesthetics and the value, and that's what's really interesting to us. So we actually just hired last year a native landscape designer on staff, and she has been kept very busy with native landscape consultations and installations where she will design these aesthetically pleasing arrangements, and we can come out and plant them ourselves or give you the plant material to plant yourself, and even maintain them throughout the years to get it for all skill levels and all interest levels of do-it-yourself gardening. And this has helped us reach an even wider audience, which we're really excited about, and has been really amazing to see the interest and the demand for this sort of thing grow over the years. But with that, we can jump back to as many questions as you have or as we have time for.
We got a standing ovation from one person. Do you know any native species that can grow under a black walnut tree?
I have actually not had very much trouble growing most natives under black walnut. We actually have a lot of prairies that go right up to walnut trees or even surround them. And I really can't say that most of those prairie species seem all that sensitive to the jugalone that is produced by them, which is one of those toxic compounds that's actually designed to inhibit plant growth. I can say that if you're having issues with plants under a black walnut, one way that you can reduce the negative impact of the plant is to rake up the black walnut leaves and pick up the walnuts in the fall and move them to another part of the yard or pile them in a consolidated area because that is the source of most of that compound. And
Very
so you
good.
can kind of prevent it from building up in that way.
Okay, thank you. One person asked, I have an area 20 foot by 40 foot. I have covered with plastic to kill off the grass and weeds in that spot. It has been covered since August. and instead of dying off, plants are growing. Just stick with it.
Yeah, you can stick with it. So we have tried that sterilization method or solarization method as well. And I found mixed results as well. It really depends on the weather that we're having, and you really have to maintain a sealed plastic environment to heat up high enough to kill those weeds. So yeah, it tends to be a bit more difficult and a lengthy process to eradicate those weeds, but the longer you can keep up with it, the better. I have seen people that will put down like cardboard over top of it and even mulch on top of the cardboard. And sometimes that helps to smother out any of the seeds as well.
Okay. She also asks, any recommendations? I have seeds I want to plant this spring to start the process. I guess what seeds maybe she's asking?
Yeah, so I would recommend going on the wildtoledo.org site and searching for the exact conditions that are in your yard and kind of filtering by them. And that would help give you the most educated, guess as to what's going to perform best. And then since you did mention, starting seeds this spring, I did just want to reiterate the dormancy that many of our native seeds require. And so they do actually require that cold dormant period in order to germinate. So if you're just getting seeds right now, you could try putting them outside immediately, and some of them might germinate for you. But actually a workaround would be to put them in a Ziploc baggie and some damp sand and stick them in your fridge for a month or two. And then later in the spring or even early summer, you could sow them. And that would be kind of a way of tricking them into a bit of a later than normal winter, but they should still sprout and grow for you without any problem.
Gretchen wants to know, she has a woodland area covered with myrtle and lily of the valley. What are the chances she can revive the seed bank and encourage natives simply by removing these?
So it really depends on the site. Those particular species are really tough, and they really do tend to smother out the good material. What you could always try is remove them first and see if you have any recruitment from that seed bank, and maybe let it go for a season. But usually in landscapes like that are so heavily degraded, you do have to reintroduce the native seed bank to encourage its growth. But there's no harm in waiting a season to see if that might not be necessary.
I think this is the last question. Will a native prairie grow in a shady area?
A native prairie will not. All of the prairie plants are more of a full sun species that aren't adapted well to shade, but we do have loads of shade tolerant native species as well. You would just be recreating a different habitat. So for that, you would want to look into different woodland type mixtures, or even savanna or dense shade garden type species. But we have tons of them that are native to the area, and actually they tend to be incredibly showy and very formal looking. So a lot of people are actually envious of more shaded growing conditions.
Oh, wow. You did a great job. I think everybody here is on board and they'd like their neighbors to be on board. Any advice how you talk to a neighbor who keeps mowing the same patch?
I've had the best luck kind of leading by example and, encourage those conversations. Say plant a milkweed by the neighbor's fence line and maybe one day flag them down to show them the 10 monarch caterpillars that are growing on it.
Right.
And I've never had anybody, turn me down or get frustrated after kind of seeing that end result.
Right.
That's the best advice that I can offer.
Jake, thank you so much for your time. I think everybody loved it. And I wish I lived closer to the Toledo Zoo.
Well, thanks for having me. It was really great chatting with you all today.
Thank you, folks. And this will come back out in an email to everyone if you want to watch it again or listen to pick up tips again. And Jake, I think you'll get a copy as well. And please fill out your surveys and have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Good night, all. Bye, Carolyn.
Bye, Tom. Thanks, Jake, very much.
Yep. Thank you. You guys have a great night.
You
Thanks.
too.
Great job, Carolyn. Good night.